Wow, what a great thought. The living hope came into the world for us. We have our new series we're starting today. Could it be true? The Christmas story has a lot of fantastical, mind-warping events that take place. And people have wondered, did that really happen? Is it really possible? Did God really enter the human race? What about the angels and the shepherds and the whole story? It's just sort of like otherworldly at times. Maybe that's what makes it so magical and so mysterious and so wonderful. And a point of celebration every year that we focus on it. And so this year, I've taken the slant because as I studied and read through the story in the book of Luke, this is the thought that hit me. Could it be true? I'm going to take the book of Luke and just over the next 4 Sundays and Christmas Eve, we're going to just kind of walk through Luke's account. And today we're going to start off with the first few verses in Luke, and it raises an interesting question. Could it be true? I read a story this week that made me wonder, is this real? It was a story of the Japanese high-speed bullet train. And it's quite a phenomenal train. Unlike the O train here in Ottawa, this one can travel 320 kilometers per hour at max speed, which is pretty incredible. 320 kilometers an hour. In fact, so fast that when it would hit a tunnel, it would create a sonic boom, which was very uncomfortable for those around and also the integrity of the tunnels. And so they had to come up with something. And so they tried as they would. They couldn't get rid of it. It was going so fast that it would create this sound wave that was rather destructive. And so they were trying to figure out how to deal with this. And I guess one of the engineers had observed in a nature show the kingfisher bird, as it would plunge into the water and diving for fish, wouldn't even make a splash. It would just sort of disappear into the water. And I said, wow, how did it do that? And he studied the dynamics of the beak. And he said, I wonder if this would work on a train. And so they tried all kinds of configurations until they tried the exact dimensions of the kingfisher beak, and they incorporated that into the nose of the train, and they found that the sonic boom disappeared at the high speeds. In fact, the train went 10% faster and used 15% less fuel. Now, when I read that story, I thought to myself, because some people believe that our world was just evolved, right? And that random chance can explain everything. But I wonder, when I read a story like that, is there really an engineering mind, a designer behind all of creation? Could it be true that there is a God in heaven that knows a thing or two about physics and engineering and designed that right into different components of nature? I have another question. This is Christmas time, so I put 4 statements on the screen for you about Christmas. One of them is true. So as you just glance through these, can you pick out which one is true? 1, Jesus was born, and I know you're thinking number 4, but refrain, that one is not the correct answer. Which one is true as you look at this list? Jesus was born on December 25th, highly unlikely. We don't really know when he was born, but according to the shepherds and the customs of the shepherds, it's probably late February, early March, they figure. But we celebrate it on December 25th because we don't know when he was born. The 3 wise men came to the stable. Well, first of all, we don't know if there was 3 wise men. We know there's 3 gifts, but we have no idea how many wise men actually came. We don't know if there's no mention of a stable, only a manger. We assume maybe a stable, but we don't know. And also, the wise men probably came 1 to 2 years after Jesus was born, according to the book of Matthew. So probably not the second one either. Likely the third, right? Is that the one you picked? The third one? Yeah, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Amazing. Because that was foretold by the prophets, that he would be born there. And God had to move an amazing way we'll talk about to get them to Bethlehem, where Jesus was eventually born. So that 3 is the correct answer. But what I wanted to illustrate here too is there's a lot of stuff in our world, even about Christmas, and we have to sort through it and decide where's truth and what's made up. And one of the things too that I noticed in just studying this and reading through Luke's account was that Luke had one of the greatest accounts of Jesus' birth, but he was also highly revered as a historian. In fact, this is what the Sir William Ramsay had to say about Luke as he studied the history. He was an expert in the historical ancient writings of antiquity. And this is what he said: Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect to its trustworthiness. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. I mean, Luke's account blows the competition out of the water. It's like, this guy's amazing. The detail, the accuracy, how it lines up with archaeology, the corroboration from other sources. It's just, Ramsay said, was utterly amazing. And another thing I want to point out about Luke is that he was a friend of Paul, one of the writers of the New Testament. In fact, this is what Paul has to say about him. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, he says, Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. So Luke is a doctor. I always chuckle when I read that, because we read all the stories of how Paul was always getting beat up and whipped and thrown out and left for dead. And how handy was that to have a doctor as best friend, you know? Like, yeah, I could see that as being needed. But Luke shows up in Acts chapter 16 for the first time. He doesn't say his name. He just starts using the word we. And we did this and we did that, speaking in reference with Paul. And you know, suddenly Luke has joined the journey, that Luke has become a follower of Jesus and is going around with Paul for the last half of the book of Acts. Before that, just a regular guy that we assume didn't know much about Jesus, but came to follow Jesus and wrote an amazing story. Another thing, too, just about the fact that he's a doctor, that explains why he uses the most medical terms and medical references in his book. For example, to take a story right out of the birth narrative in Luke chapter 2, it says, on the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise the child, he was named Jesus, which is an interesting custom that the Jewish people would have of circumcision on the 8th day for male boys, which is really quite amazing. When we think about this, we've done some research on this, and when a baby is born, it's not a good idea to do surgery because their blood doesn't coagulate and doesn't heal. In fact, you have to get shots for babies in the first few days. And because when you're born, it's usually the prothrombin in your hemoglobin, those are big terms I had to look up, but that basically is at 30% where it should be of a normal person when you're first born, and that rises drastically in the first 7 days. And by the time you get to day 8, it hits 110%. In other words, that's the best day in your life to have surgery, and then it drops back down for a regular to about 100% or normal for the rest of your life. But I found that kind of interesting, that it hits the best day for surgery. And it just so happened that was the day the Jews chose for this medical. Like, is that made up? I mean, could it be true? Is it possible that, like, how would they have known that back then? They didn't. But that was the custom that God had introduced at that time, and it made so much medical sense. And sort of Luke picks up on that and writes it into his story, where he's the only one that happens to mention that because he's a doctor. Another thing I might say, let's just get right into it. I want to look at Luke's account. We've talked a little bit about his background, who he was. So let's start off with a story in Luke chapter 1. I say today I want to cover the first 4 verses. And this is what he writes. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Many people, he said, have been writing about this, which gives you the sense that there's been an excitement. There's been a buzz that's going on, that people are like, wow, this is amazing. There's something incredible that's happened here among us in our day, in our time. And so he's writing about this. And he says, many have drawn up the account. Many of people have been writing about this. This has been pretty exciting. This is earth-shattering news. And so lots of people have picked up their pen and started to write down about this account. And because something has been fulfilled. It's an interesting word, has been fulfilled. He didn't say something happened among us, but something was fulfilled, which gives you the sense that it was talked about beforehand and it's now come to happen. Something that had been predicted. And sure enough, in the Old Testament, Luke was made aware that there was a lot of stuff in the Old Testament, that things that were talked about Jesus, over 350 prophecies that describe Jesus in the Old Testament, and he said they were fulfilled in our time. No wonder there was a buzz. No wonder there was excitement about this. In fact, one of the great ones we have behind, we've got some of these words from the prophet Isaiah, who was told that when the Messiah come, he would be called the Almighty God, right? The wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, Everlasting Father. These are descriptive words of the Messiah. But they're not just anybody. You can't call anybody Mighty God. I mean, amazing prophetic things. And Luke was saying, this happened among us. This was fulfilled. Jesus was born. The Mighty God became flesh and dwelt among us. And he was, in the very first verse, he sets the tone and the excitement and the anticipation for what's coming in the rest of the story. You know, he also says that that it happened among us. In other words, he was a contemporary. Even though Luke himself was not living among them at the time, he was not an eyewitness. He did the research. He read the others' accounts. He talked to the people and got a lot of his detail. And it's interesting that 400 years had passed and there was silence. Not much had happened. And all of a sudden, everything started to change. And God started to move. And the people got excited about it and they started writing about the story. And it happened, as he said, among us, which is important because myths take a long time to grow. In fact, you have to generally die off a generation before myths can really grow and get bigger. And you can take stories and twist them because you don't have any eyewitnesses anymore. But Luke was saying, hey, no, this happened among us. There's lots of witnesses. You can check it out. There was no time for a myth to grow. Many have undertaken to draw up an account, he says, of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Verse 2, just as they were handed down to us by those from the first who were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord. People who had seen it and been with Jesus and talked with Jesus. He's talking about eyewitnesses. The other three gospel writers, you know there's four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four writers that we have in the New Testament part of our Bibles that tell Jesus' story. The other three were all eyewitnesses of Jesus. They walked with him, disciples or part of his life, except for Luke. Luke was not. He became a Christian later on and went back and investigated it all. The other three were eyewitnesses. It's interesting, though, that when it says the word handed down, it almost sounds like it handed down over many years, but it's not, right? He talked to those people who were eyewitnesses, who were there. It was current. We read the story earlier about communion when we read from Luke chapter 22 for communion. And it's interesting how those words, how similar they are to Paul's writing. Some have suggested that Paul was very aware of what Luke had written because they were contemporaries, they were friends. They talked about it, they celebrated together communion. And that's why their accounts are so similar. But it meant they were contemporaries. They lived just after Jesus rose from the dead. And that's when these words were written. I read the story this week of a knife fight. I guess two gang members in California had gone at it and had severely wounded themselves in a knife fight. And there were no witnesses. At least nobody wanted to pretend they were there. Everyone sort of shut up. And the police were trying to get some of the story and figure out what was going on. And these guys were wanted for a lot of crimes, so they were thrown in jail as they were collecting the information. And one of the witnesses actually came a few months later, and she showed up and says, I was a witness, and I want to tell you the story. And they finally said, well, finally somebody's willing to say something. And they said, well, why didn't you show up sooner? It says, well, I'm in the military. I was posted overseas, so I wasn't here to tell the story. And then she shares her story, but there were some questions. And they dug into her story, and they found out that, first of all, she wasn't overseas. She was in the military, but she was in Texas. In fact, they have phone records and credit card information that show she was in Texas. And suddenly they realized she wasn't there in California. She couldn't have been an eyewitness. And so her whole story crumbled. And isn't it true? Like, you have to have been there. And that's why Luke makes notice that I talked to the first-hand witnesses. These people were there. They knew the story. They walked with Jesus. They were a part of the whole thing that happened. And that's very important, because the truth was based on these eyewitness testimonies. And he's making a big deal out of that right at the beginning. He wants you to know that that he's carefully researched with the people who were there and walked with Jesus. In fact, he goes on in the next couple of verses and says this, with this in mind, since I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account, just like all the other people, for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now, there's three things, and I highlighted them for you here in the wording, that emphasize how accurate, the attention to detail and accuracy he had, right? Carefully investigated everything, he says. An orderly account and the certainty of the things you've been taught. He wants these people, he wants us to know, right from the get-go as he writes this book, that he's paid very careful attention to the details to make sure you get them right. And that's why Ramsey, as I quoted earlier, considers him, as he's investigated and compared this with others, said this is one of the prime examples of historical accuracy. The other thing, though, another question I have when I come to this verse is, who is Theophilus? Because he's not mentioned elsewhere. Who is Theophilus? Some have suggested, well, maybe because the Theophilus means friend of God, maybe it's just written generally to all those who are friends of God. And yet, he uses something he calls the most excellent Theophilus. Most excellent Theophilus. So, and he does that in the book of Acts chapter 24, when he calls someone most excellent. It's Felix and Festus. Two Roman authorities, he calls them most excellent. And so this is probably a title. And Luke was giving this guy Theophilus. Maybe a Roman ruler of some sort. And yet we look in the history books and there was none that were contemporaries of Jesus that we know of. So who was it? And then some have suggested that there was a Jewish priest who, after Jesus rose from the dead, and it was the years 37 to 41, a guy by the name of Theo ben Annas, the son of Annas, was made the high priest at the temple. And he seemed to have a reputation of being someone who was curious about of Jesus and his followers. He was appointed by the Romans, so maybe that's where he got the title most excellent, even though he was Jewish, and given a Roman name, Theophilus, a Greek name, loved of God, friend of God, kind of take off of his actual name, Theo. So maybe this was the person. Another interesting thing about Luke's account that makes me think that maybe this was the guy was that Luke is very interested in the temple. The book of Luke starts in the temple. In fact, in verse 5, we'll see next week, we see Zacharias in the temple going in to do a sacrifice. So it starts in the temple. We've got Jesus coming to the temple as a child to be circumcised, unique to Luke. We've got Anna and Simeon mentioned at the temple that meet the baby Jesus. And so the temple is instrumental at the beginning all the way through. In fact, look at the last couple of verses. Let me read the last 2 verses in the book of Luke. It says, this is after Jesus died, rose again. It says, then they worshipped him, Jesus, and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And they stayed continually at the temple, praising God. I just find it interesting that Luke has, he didn't even grow up in Jerusalem, we don't believe, and we're not certain of this, but it doesn't seem like he knew much about Jesus until later, and he picked that all up in his research, but he has this interesting fascination with the temple. And all through the book, and as I say, the way he leaves them off in the book is they're worshiping with great joy. And that's another theme we just see through the whole book. You just see joy all the way through, from the birth narratives, with the angels and the shepherds and Anna and Simeon. All these people are just filled with great joy. And then at the end of the book, after Jesus rises from the dead, you just get the sense of all the joy that's a part of it, from beginning to end of the book. Now, let me just shift gears a little bit again. In Luke's account, he does something else. So he starts off with in the beginning of the book talking about the birth narratives, and extensively talks about. He obviously spent some time with Mary and got a lot of the details from her, Jesus' mother. And then there's this transition in chapter 3, and then we get into his ministry after that. And in those transitions, it says in chapter 3, there's a genealogy list of all the people from Mary and Joseph all the way back to their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, all the way back to David, back to Abraham, back to Adam. And it's interesting, it says, now Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph, the son of Heli. It goes on, the son of, for the next bunch of verses. It's just all this list of these son ofs. But 2 things are interesting to me. He says, so it was thought. Did you notice that? It was assumed that he was the son of Joseph, but he was not really. Because we know the story. He was born of a virgin, Mary. And the adoptive father was Joseph. And so he adds that little phrase in there, so it was thought. He was the son, which I found interesting. The other thing is the fact that he would throw a genealogy in here. Why did he do that? I mean, probably the main reason we think of is because he wanted to trace Jesus back to David. But what was the impact of that? Maybe the best way to describe it is by telling you a story of Ron and Linda Hayward. These were some missionaries, Bible translators over in Papua New Guinea, and they were translating and telling the people about Jesus and translating the story. And as the people read the story of Jesus, they were quite fascinated by it all. But it's when they hit the genealogies, which most of us kind of skip over, like this list of names, like, what's that for? But when they read that list of names, all of a sudden the light came on for them, and they said, "Oh, this is a real story. Like, they have a family history. There's roots here. This isn't a once upon a time in the land, this wasn't made up. This is real." And I think that's the impact that Luke wanted you to have too. When you read the genealogy at this point, he wants you to understand this is a real story rooted in history. This isn't just made up fairy tales. Because and it's not random, but God came into this world, and he's trying to do the best job he can from the first 4 verses, and then at the end of the birth narratives to have this genealogy, because he wants to bookend it and say, this is real. This is certain. In fact, his good friend Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Let me just read a few verses, familiar verses, often read around Easter. He says, "For what I received," Paul says, "with the stuff I received, I passed on to you," Corinthians, as I'm writing, as of first importance. This is the most important thing. This is the one thing you got to get straight. If I could boil it all down to one thing, this would be it. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, just like the Bible said. He was crucified, buried, raised the third day. And that he appeared to Cephas or Peter and then to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living. And that's significant. He's saying there are lots of eyewitnesses. You can check, you can go and ask them. They're still around. This isn't a myth. They're still around. And he writes that because, like Luke, he's saying this was not a myth. This is well rooted in history. We didn't just sort of get some message from some angel in a cave somewhere and this is God's... No, this was a part of our history. This is our story, and there's lots of people you can ask about this. It's interesting, as I said earlier, that Luke was very interested in the temple, and yet he never records the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 A.D. I'm thinking, with all the interest and all the references to the temple, if the temple had been destroyed, he would have mentioned that, unless it hadn't happened yet. And so all these writings happened before the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. So over that 40-year period, and that's why he says all these people are still living. You can just ask them. No time for myths to grow. Lots of Old Testament stories to be certain of. And so here's my final wrap-up 3 points. First of all, our faith is based in reality. And I think that's what Luke was saying here in these first verses. That is based in reality. And that's important, especially for us in a culture where there's so much spin, so much twisting of facts and conspiracy theories and partisan reporting, that we hardly know what's truth anymore. And so Luke is doing his best attempt at saying this is accurate historically. You never need to be ashamed. It's not biased. And if you're new to the faith, know that this is something that you can take to the bank, right? It's truth. I read an article recently that said that the Gen Z generation, those that are young adults and youth, high school and young adults, are more interested in truth than their predecessors. And that part of that thinking is the reason why there's all this fact checking, right? You've got to check facts because suddenly truth is back in vogue. It was out of vogue for quite a few years. It's like, well, if it works or if it's good, who cares if it's true? There's no absolutes anyway. And suddenly in the last few years, no, facts matter. And truth matters again. And I think that's exciting because that's what Luke is trying to get across here. The facts matter. And if you fact check it with all the other sources, you'll see that this is the truth. What we're based on is true. The second thing I wanted to say is that there is hope. There is hope in the silence. As I said, it had been 400 years since anything had happened in Israel. 400 years. That's a long time. And over that long period of time, God had seemingly disappeared. There were no miracles. There were no new books being written by prophets. Nothing. From Malachi to Matthew, there's this gap between the Old and New Testaments of a long period of time and nothing. And all of a sudden, Luke says, something happened, and we all started writing about it. We started seeing God's fingerprints over all these different events. Something happened. They were talking around the campfires. Everybody's excited about it. One of the stories Luke tells only in Luke. You only find this story in the book of Luke. In chapter 24, there's a couple of disciples who had watched Jesus be crucified, and a couple of days later, in fact, the day he rose from the dead, but they didn't know it yet, because Jesus had just risen from the dead, and they're making their way back to Emmaus, and they meet this guy on the road, and they start talking, and they don't know it's Jesus yet. And Jesus says, "Why are you so downcast? Why are you so glum?" And they said, "Well, haven't you heard? I mean, you must be the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard." And what they're saying is, everybody's talking about this. This is like big news. Everyone knows that Jesus, the Messiah, was here, and we put him on a cross. This didn't happen in some hole in the wall. Everybody knew about this. This is a big deal. And that's why Luke is so excited to tell this story, because this was a big deal that was happening. The silence had broken. God was at work again. And that brings hope into the world, that God is moving. This week, one of the family members that I have had a best friend that committed suicide. And so it's been a tough week. And in discussing and looking into it, I've heard that I guess there have been more and more suicides than usual lately. And it's like, what's going on? Why are people giving up? Why does the world feel so hopeless to some people? And I think one of the things about this story, and Luke's story, is that it's going to just ooze hope. Next week we're going to take a look at Zachariah and Elizabeth, an older couple that seem to have no hope of having children, and God pours into it. And so hope is just all through this story. And I think it's a great reminder that there is a God who wants to speak into our lives and pour hope and purpose into our lives, even when we feel that there's none there. And then the final thing that I see out of these first few verses is this idea of joy. There's great joy. I get that sense as he talks about the stuff that was fulfilled among us, that there was excitement in his voice, the tone of his writing. He was excited about writing this book to Theophilus, because something amazing happened. And then you don't have to get very far into the book, and we're going to find Zachariah and Elizabeth celebrating with joy, and Jesus being born, and the angels saying good news, joy, great joy to all people. And we see the Elizabeth and Zachariah, and the joy that they have of finally laying their eyes on the Messiah who is born. And then you get to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and the joy they had when they saw Jesus, and then the disciples at the end of the book in the temple every day rejoicing. It just joy all through the story, and it starts at Christmas. And I think what better time, when the days are getting shorter and we feel the heaviness of the weather and the weather systems, and you can feel and the pressure of the busyness and all. It can feel like a joyless time of year. And in the midst of that, there's this celebration. For the purpose of it is to pump joy into our systems, into our thinking, into our psyche. And what better time than to focus on the story of Christmas and the joy that God has entered our world. And I just see that as a key part of the story that we're going to look at with Luke. So, as we think about this, we think that faith, hope, and joy are a part of the story that Jesus wants to pump into our lives as we read this and as we consider this Christmas. Let me pray for you. Lord Jesus, I thank you for this time that we have together. And I thank you for your word. I thank you for Luke, for the enthusiasm that he had as he embarked on this journey of telling the story of the Messiah. Lord, I thank you for the anticipation and for as we move into this Christmas season, I'm grateful that we have a hope and a future and a story that brings great joy at a time when people need to hear this. Lord, I would just pray that as we walk into this section of your word that Luke recorded, that we would know that you were there and that you walked with him and you guided him, just like you want to guide us. God, thank you for coming, and thank you for being with us. In Jesus' name, amen.